Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Harton, your host for today's podcast. Today, we're talking to city planners in Fayetteville and Rogers. They're working on a couple of major changes to the way their respective towns will develop in the decades to come. What's that mean for the future? Stay with us for this edition of the Speaking of Arkansas podcast. In broad terms, today's discussion focuses on the future of development in Fayetteville and Rogers. All indications point to continued, almost overwhelming growth in Northwest Arkansas. The question for city planners is how municipal policies will guide, or some might say dictate, how commercial and residential buildings are built and how they function in the greater community. Another question is how all this works together to either keep a city as a desirable place to live or how it could all fail to function well together and become a burden on residents and businesses. In Fayetteville, city leaders are nearing decisions about the future of development along what used to be known as US 71B, the highway that goes right through the middle of town. It's an intensely commercial multi-lane road that more or less splits the city down the middle. The city has taken ownership of that former state highway, and Britin Bostick is the long-range planner for the city of Fayetteville and joins us today to talk about that. Welcome, Britin.
Thank you so much for having me.
In Rogers, city leaders are also talking about future plans, but there it's a new citywide and comprehensive approach to how the city officials interact with developers, the public, and new construction projects. This involves a new map to guide future land uses and a new master street plan. From the City of Rogers, I'm joined today by John McCurdy, Director of Community Development, and Joe Rexwinkle, Deputy Director. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Thanks, Greg.
So let's start with an admittedly broad overview of some pretty complex issues. Britin, can you give our listeners a basic breakdown of what you've been working on with regard to the old US 71 business highway, which I'll just say I'm going to probably call it College Avenue through this whole thing, even though it really involves College Avenue, Nelson Hackett Boulevard, which used to be Archibald Yale, and South School Avenue. So tell us a little bit about that project.
If you will go back almost 100 years with me, that's really where this project starts. And so long-range planning includes historic preservation. So you will almost never see me talk about planning projects without a little bit of a history lesson. If you think about Fayetteville at the end of World War II, the city had about 10,000 people. And they were in the middle of a really big transition, doubling the population between 1940 and 1950. And you can imagine that was like really extreme population growth, and there were a lot of concerns. Not enough housing, all of the congestion that was happening, things that would seem very familiar today. And from that, Fayetteville began to develop outward along highways. And the city council in 1951 said, overcrowding is the worst evil of cities, so we want everybody to spread out. They also said we don't want commercial encroaching into residential neighborhoods. And so they very deliberately separated commercial and residential in our zoning code. And that still persists today. And so 71B, or what a lot of people will recognize as College Avenue, because that's where the bulk of the development is, there is a lot of zoning that does not allow housing right in the middle of the city, right where services are, right where transportation options are, right where our best opportunity for a very big transit route is. And so as you think about what we need to do to move forward into the future with all the people who want to live in Fayetteville, why not give them the opportunity to live in a place that for 70 years has not allowed the construction of housing, but is central to our city?
Is there any residential zoning along that route?
Only on the very south end of South School, about where you get to the Fulbright Expressway, or what people may be more familiar with, the Washington County Jail. Across the road from that is a little bit of very low-density residential zoning, but that's about it, with the exception of downtown. There's a stretch through downtown that would allow housing as well, and a lot of it is still houses some of those historic.
Yeah, and I guess the jail can't count as residential.
Not not in the way that we're thinking about it currently. And it couldn't be technically considered because it's in a zoning district that also does not allow housing.
Okay. So, Mr. McCurdy, our newspapers reported about the changes happening in Rogers, and they've basically said, and I'm assuming this kind of came from you guys, that it's an effort to more closely align municipal oversight of development with residents' aspirations for the city. So tell me a little bit about what that means and kind of how y'all came to the conclusions of what the aspirations of the city are.
Sure. It's an ongoing dynamic process that kind of never ends as cities deal with what they want to be when they grow up. From time to time, about every 5 or so years, the city partners with the Chamber of Commerce to go through an exercise to kind of redefine our values and aspirations as a city. And most recently, this resulted in a Vision 100 document that's anticipating population of 100,000 people. And I could echo pretty much what was just said about Fayetteville as the path that the city of Rogers has taken, and the vast majority of municipalities around the country since World War II in dealing with the baby boom and concerns over urban densification. Cities tended to grow outward. And so since 1980, when Rogers had a major lateral expansion of its city limits, we have continued to grow outward, mostly out to the east and along the highways. And so that expansion down the highways creates kind of this linear sprawl pattern where city planning, frankly, was more a matter of predicting future commercial growth and less a matter of managing future commercial growth. And then the growth of subdivisions around schools and things like that, really just kind of trying to anticipate where the growth is happening so that infrastructure could keep up with it. And at this point, I think all the cities in Northwest Arkansas are faced with having come to a fork in the road where we're looking at significant future population growth. For a number of reasons, we're seeing diversification of the economy around the Walmart vendor community and other major corporations, the growth of the University of Arkansas, so that we have a chance right now to kind of take a look at growth throughout the region and think about how we want to manage that. If we continue to sprawl, the cost of maintaining the infrastructure is very high. Quality of life tends to be very low because you end up spending a couple of hours a day in your car just getting to and from work. And so much like Fayetteville, we're looking at ways to not only allow but to encourage higher density residential growth near services and mixed among services and employment opportunities, so that you don't have to go all the way to the Oklahoma state line to find, or Missouri, to find affordable housing, and then you spend your life in a car. So we believe that just about all the projected population growth in Northwest Arkansas could be handled along the 71B corridor, and that could make a lot of sense. It could allow us to have transit in the area that could be a whole lot more efficient and thereby further reduce the cost of living. So it can end up being a win-win for everyone, where the cost of ownership of infrastructure to the city is reduced, so which keeps taxes as low as they can be as we become bigger and bigger, and at the same time maintain a good quality of life. And by the way, nobody in Northwest Arkansas is talking about not allowing people to live out on some land and have a single-family house or anything like that. It's simply about allowing other housing options to help fill the gap between the demand and the supply of housing.
So does this require a major mindset shift among residents of your towns? We live in communities that for the most part have not promoted density and have not promoted buildings that go up that very far. And I think, if you start talking about density, you start talking about going up. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of conversations about, to what extent residents want, I don't know. You always hear fears of high rises. In Fayetteville, we've got that project that down in front of Collier's that is, I think 7 or 8 stories.
I think 7.
Yes. And you've got You've got properties nearby where people are concerned about the shadow that'll cast, those sorts of issues. So how do you get that density and also work within the comfort level of residents? Or is this just something residents just have to get past?
You bring up very valid points. And I think if you step back a moment, we hear a lot of concern from citizens and social media about folks just lamenting the past is gone. And, wouldn't it be great if we could turn the clock back to when Rogers had, less than 10,000 residents, which was the case when I was growing up. Bentonville was a very small town. And on the one hand, I just recently traveled across Arkansas a couple of weeks ago and visited a whole lot of small towns that are absolutely struggling to survive. It doesn't seem to be an option in this part of the country to simply remain small, and to not embrace growth and economic vitality and diversification of the economy. It's kind of a grow or die situation. So the very idea that we could have stayed the way that we were just doesn't match the reality that we see in other rural areas. But for the existence of companies like J.B. Hunt and Walmart and the growth of the university system and others, who knows what we'd look like right now. And so that past was not sustainable. Unfortunately, with growth comes more growth. And as a region, we're getting to the point where we become more and more attractive for other companies to relocate to Northwest Arkansas. The growth predictions that we have are basically straight line estimates based on past growth, but it could very well be that we'll see some fundamental shifts in the economy that will bring greater entrepreneurship, that will bring more diversification of the economy, and growth leads to growth. We could see this spike even quicker than we think it's going to. So it's not a matter of are we going to grow. I don't think any of the city planners are doing anything to per se encourage growth. We're simply looking at how do we want to manage that growth so that it's economically sustainable, it doesn't lead to future blight. We maximize the quality of living in what will become a metropolitan type area, not on the order of Kansas City or Dallas, but certainly much larger than we currently are. And how can we shape the future of Northwest Arkansas in such a way that it's the kind of place that people are going to want to come and spend time? They're going to want to come here for the week and do business and then bring their families over the weekend and maybe vacation here. It's the kind of place that you would travel to versus the kind of place you would travel from. And that involves maintaining some of the natural environment, reducing, at least minimizing future congestion. But all the problems that come with densification and urbanization are coming here. And it's just a matter of how do we manage that growth in the best way that we can. So I don't know if that really answers the question. I think it's a reality check for all of us. It's a good problem to have. It's a bad problem to have, depending on your perspective. And it's just a matter of how do you handle all those people.
I think a lot of folks. I moved here in '96. And I think increasingly I've seen where a lot of folks are glad they're here and they're ready for us to shut the border down now that they're here.
Right.
And because they came to a place that they already love, and now like in the case of Fayetteville, we're talking about, what really is a major change to this major route through the town. And you've spoken before in some of the public meetings about, and you did an in-depth study on housing. And tell us a little bit about, the reality of what we're having to prepare for in terms of creating all this new housing in Fayetteville.
Well, and our growth is unique in the region, just in that we have the University of Arkansas campus here, and they've increased their enrollment a lot very quickly. And so we may see, in some years recently, it's been 2,000 additional students annually. And that's very different from regular population, non-student population growth, because they all arrive in 1 week in August. And so all of a sudden you have 2,000 extra people in your city all at once instead of incrementally over the course of a year. And so what's been kind of interesting is to see students are living in Fayetteville in neighborhoods they've never lived in before. Students are living in houses that have been traditionally thought of as family neighborhoods, and family meaning traditional households with younger children. And so people are very surprised to see that they might have 4 college students next door when they've never had a college student, much less 4 or more in their neighborhood. And so when we begin to look at what our housing needs are, Fayetteville has, for the last several years, had a lot of student apartments. So it's very specifically designed, built, and marketed for students. They're usually leased by the bedrooms. And we're the only city in Northwest Arkansas, I think, with that model. Contrast that with what has mostly been single-family or traditional subdivision housing. And so when you only have housing built primarily in those 2 extremes, you have a lot of people in your community who don't have the right fit housing for them. They aren't able to get into an apartment because they're not a student, and we're not getting a lot of apartments that are not student-oriented. And maybe a traditional house in a new subdivision, maybe that's on the edge of the city, is not what they're looking for. Because if you look at our downtown is a place that people love to be. It's a place that we are right now. And we don't have housing being developed in our downtown that allows a lot of additional people to live here and enjoy the benefits. We have apartments that are maybe being built on the edge of town, but when you build all of those units on the edge and people's only option is to drive a car, that creates a lot of traffic that you didn't otherwise have. And I think people understand that very intuitively. They understand kind of some of these, what they perceive to be negative effects, changes to their living situation caused by other people that they're not particularly excited about. And I think that's what you were alluding to. But I think one of the opportunities that the 71B corridor rezoning presents is the opportunity to diversify some of our housing choices and give people who want it, and I think John said this really well, we're not telling people that they should live a particular way. We're giving opportunities for people to have a lifestyle choice that they would prefer if that opportunity were to exist, and it currently doesn't.
So as far as 71B, and I think you mentioned somewhere along the line that right now there's and you're going to know what I'm talking about here because I may not, but that it's as it's currently zoned, the max you can have is like 6 units per acre or something. I may be stating that wrong, but
I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, tell me what that is.
When we look at the bulk of the current zoning along that corridor, it's our C2 commercial zoning, and it really doesn't allow for any housing. So we went and looked at how much housing we actually have. Housing that maybe you wouldn't be allowed to build under the current zoning code because that's been in place for a while. And so effectively, we have about 1 house for every 6 acres on average along the corridor. And 1 house for every 6 acres puts you in a very rural setting in terms of housing density. So the most common residential zoning in Fayetteville, RSF4, people see it on the map as a yellow, and a lot of people can identify that yellow because they live in a neighborhood with it. That's 4 units per acre. That's 24 times the average of how much housing we have on average along the corridor. And for all of our transit advocates, people who want to see really well operating consistent bus lines, people who would love to see rail and have that aspiration, you're looking at densities that don't even really get there at 10 units per acre. You really need to get around 30 units per acre. So we would need to transition that entire corridor, which is I think around 500, 600 acres of land, from 6 acres for every house to 30 houses for every acre. It's starting to do some multiplication and a lot of multiplication. And so for everyone who has thought, why can't College Avenue in particular, I think College Avenue is probably the better example, why can't College Avenue have some of the amenities I'm looking for? Why don't we have better sidewalks? Why don't we have, more housing? And especially why don't we have better transit? We don't have enough people living in close proximity. But we could have that happen. And what I like to think about is what would happen if College Avenue could become a beloved neighborhood in Fayetteville, like so many of our other neighborhoods are. And people do not look at it as a beloved neighborhood today, but it has the potential to be one. And I think that's really what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I live in east side of Fayetteville, and I certainly look at College Avenue as just the route to get to where I'm going.
Exactly.
And I think in one of the meetings you you were asked about the redevelopment of, and we're talking about over decades, really, but the redevelopment of College Avenue and whether it can handle, a new College Avenue could handle the traffic of all these housing units that we're talking about putting on there. And I think you said something along the lines of, I'm a city planner. It's not my job to get from point A to help you get from point A to point B easily. It's to create I think you use the same term, beloved urban neighborhood. I think there's a little trepidation on the part of people when they use College Avenue so often. And the same thing, 71B in Rogers, that when you're talking about kind of changing the dynamic of that, they're like, okay, well, how am I going to get around at that point?
And that's really fair. That was certainly a hot take of mine. But it was really meant to make the point that, so many of the other goals the city of Fayetteville has have to do with safety, have to do with people being able to navigate the city safely, whether they're in a car or on foot or on a bicycle or using a scooter or in a wheelchair or using a mobility assistive device. And College Avenue right now does not give you that safety. And so when we look at the number of fatalities and the number of injury accidents that occur in these places where there are so many, we call them turning movements. Every time you're in and out of a driveway or every time you're turning from one street to another, there are so many turning movements on College that it creates a scenario that's very dangerous, especially if you're not in a vehicle, but also if you're in a vehicle. And so one of the things that we've been talking about and that I've been working with our active transportation team on is how do we help people think of this place as truly a neighborhood and not as a valueless pass-through that they're just trying to get through on their way to do business or to do what they need to do that day. And that is where we kind of got the, we're not FADOT, we're not the Fayetteville Department of Transportation. And when you think about this has been a highway for over 100 years, the expectation is move cars as fast as possible. But when you're doing that in, kind of a rural setting, whether it's just fields, maybe that's okay because there's not a lot of people turning in and out. In a city of over 100,000 people, it's a completely different scenario. And so that's really what we're trying to focus on is our city is over 100,000 people. It's rapidly headed toward 150. And so we are honestly no longer trying to get people to move as quickly as possible because we don't want the risks that come with that. But it doesn't mean that people should have to sit in traffic for an hour and a half just to go 5 miles. That's also not what we're trying to do. And ultimately, I don't think what is going to happen because we are keeping lanes. So we're not reducing College Avenue. We're not reducing South School. I know we reduced Nelson Hackett Boulevard. So I know people can look at that and say, well, you've already done it. You're going to do it for the rest. None of the plans, none of the design plans include that. But what they do include are wider sidewalks and a reduction in the number of driveways so that we can get closer to that safer outcome while keeping those traffic lanes intact.
So what do you guys envision as ultimately the outcome of these plans? As I say, you've got the rezoning of College Avenue, this comprehensive plan, which I don't know that I would call it a rezoning plan.
It does come with a rezoning plan.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. And Master Street plan. One, I guess, how do you know, we talked a little bit about the values of the community. I'm guessing that certainly in Fayetteville, where everybody has plenty of opinions, and Rogers no different, it's walking down the street, you're going to hear a lot about different people's values. How do you know you're getting it right? Because this is where you guys are going to be. You're not telling the developers precisely what to do, but you're kind of putting boundaries to identify what the community wants developers to contribute to the greater good, I guess you'd say. So how do we know that we're headed in the right direction, Joe? You have any thoughts on that?
One of the things that we're doing in Rogers with our comprehensive plan that's kind of unique is that it doesn't have an expiration date. A lot of comprehensive plans, when they're adopted, they have a 20 or 30-year horizon to them, and the city just expects to kind of hit the reset button at that time. We're, as John mentioned earlier, working with our chamber, which really does a lot of quality of life planning efforts, so that's why they're such a good partner. We're really working with them on trying to capture the community's values on a regular basis. And so building off of what the values are, and then with particular stakeholders that have technical expertise, is kind of, I think, the best way of doing it. That's the approach we're going to try. We're going to know whether or not we're working by the process by which we annually look back on our comprehensive plan and have a public conversation once a year with our planning commission, but anyone in the general public as well. And look at the data. We hope to make more data-informed decisions going forward. Are we providing the missing middle housing that Britin was, I believe, referring to between the two extremes? That's a big goal. That's a big missing piece to the affordability crisis that everyone's dealing with now, not just Northwest Arkansas. So we hope that we're achieving things just because we've been listening, but we'll find out each year when we do a look back on that.
So what is the, a lot of respect for chambers of commerce, but are they driving this, or is it a broader community involvement sort of thing in Rogers?
It's more of a partnership with the Chamber of Commerce that we have used the chamber as a partner to provide the platform for public engagement at the values level.
Okay.
And I think it's important to distinguish between the values level and the tactical, how do you get it done level. For example, the city citizens have expressed value in well-maintained streetscape and keeping the flowers blooming and things like that. And at the same time have expressed an interest in controlling taxes over the long run. Well, those are seemingly two competing things, but it becomes a math problem at that point. How do you do these things? How do you allow for growth in such a way that you're able to take care of the things that you're getting? Well, in a theoretical sense, this is just a mind experiment. If you could absorb all of the growth into a very small piece of land, theoretically, the cost of maintaining that very small piece of land is reduced, versus if we had all of the growth in, let's say, 1 unit per 6 acre low density residential that went all the way to the Missouri and Oklahoma borders. You can imagine that the cost of maintaining all that streetscape, of keeping everything up, is going to be exorbitantly high and lead to future insolvency for the region. And so the tactics of getting to realizing those values may not be popular. Another example is roundabouts. I mean, people want safe streets. They want safe streets, and they want streets that are minimally congested, and they want to spend as little time getting from here to there as possible. The data is incontrovertible that roundabouts provide better flow, reduced travel times, and are way safer than signalized intersections. And yet people hate roundabouts. Some people hate roundabouts. Until you get to the point where they're demonstrated and we see the benefits of those, you're gonna see some growing pains. And so I think that the role of leadership in all of this, political leadership and political will, is to engage with the public and lead public opinion, to show people and educate people how the tactics that we're employing to achieve our goals are aligned with people's values, and it's the best alternative. Again, we're managing growth. And so if growth is a bad thing in your eyes, then you're never going to be completely satisfied with the fact that we're managing growth. But I don't know how to stop it. I don't know that it would be wise to stop it if we could. And so we're making the most of what we have. And I really do think that we're at a crossroads where if we get this right, Northwest Arkansas continues to have the lifestyle that brought us here. We continue to preserve the wilderness in the area, the Ozarks, all the great outdoor activities, the open space, public spaces. We continue to have these great cultural venues that we've seen pop up over the last few decades, and we just keep building on that. And we avoid becoming gridlocked as a great big sprawling area that has bedroom communities for miles and miles in every direction. So, and I think that that's kind of the dichotomy. That's kind of the two choices that we have. So you can't have everything you want, and anything that we do is going to involve compromise, and not everybody's going to be thrilled about everything.
Well, you've been through enough public meetings that people aren't afraid to ask for everything they want.
That's right.
But that's okay. That's what y'all are there for, and we'll, to work through. I think last week y'all kind of ran into some issues with like the meeting where the questions came up about I think administrative approval of large scale developments, and I think some of the planning commissioners kind of got a little uncomfortable with that, or one or two. I'm not sure how many were involved in that, but that's something that has been part of kind of that public meeting process. And as I understand it, you guys are talking about doing that administratively in a way that you hope will streamline things. I think you said, for good building projects, you want to get to yes as quickly as you can. So help me to understand the public involvement in that particular aspect.
Well, I think it's just all part of our evolution as a region into doing things more like they are done in larger areas. When I started with the City of Rogers in 2016, at that time the Planning Commission was literally reviewing construction plans. I mean, the detailed drawings were all laid out around a big table, and they're measuring slopes of drain pipes and things like that. But we really didn't have a professional planning staff. Since that time, we've built a planning staff, we've built a community development department, and those plans are now professionally reviewed by people that are trained to review those things. And if they're compliant, then the Planning Commission is recommended to approve the plans. If they're not compliant, then we say they're not compliant. Those are
Compliant
technical
with
the development code.
Existing or
Right.
whatever is in place at that point.
Right.
Okay.
Because ultimately the city has expressed what the city wants. And I mean the city as collectively, we the people of the city, through our elected officials in the political process, have expressed our values in a series of rules. And if somebody comes in with a project that complies with those rules, it ought to be approved. And if it's not approved, then the city has some serious explaining to do if challenged on the denial. And so this is no different from if you were to submit electrical plans for a home renovation, it has to apply with the building code. And if it does, you get a building permit. If it doesn't, you don't. And so when it comes to the actual site planning and whether or not a development complies with the development code, to me that's a technical question, and it ought to be answered technically and not so much a political question. The political part of this, though, is the feedback loop to make sure that what is being built is what we want to be built, and if that doesn't hook up, if that doesn't reflect our values, then the rules need to be changed. And so it's not that the public is not involved. The public is not as involved in every individual decision that's made at sort of that technical level. And I think that's true everywhere. Anytime you do a lot of public hearing and public engagement around does this thing comply with the code, you give the impression that this is a public decision that's being made, but it's still a technical decision that's being made. That engagement is more about evaluating whether we agree with the rule than it is about whether or not the thing being proposed is compliant with the rule set.
So we talked a little bit about transit. I think we're all aware that transit has kind of scraped and struggled, and we're talking about Ozark Regional Transit in Fayetteville. You've got Razorback Transit, which is really student focused. But we from an editorial perspective at our newspaper, we have for years been supportive of more transit, but as you talked about, it's not like the cities are designed for transit. So it sounds like maybe there's more hope for transit in the future. You think that will eventually come into existence?
Well, let me speak to that, and then I'll from a transit perspective, because I'm also a member of the ORT board and I've been involved in this quite a bit. I think that the fundamental issue with transit in Northwest Arkansas is that the way that ORT and local transit works is that we divide federal money among the cities, and then the cities match that federal money in order to create transit within the boundaries of that city. And so, for example, if you're a very small city, even within the core of Northwest Arkansas, you simply can't afford to have a bus stop. And that's, to me, that's an inherently inefficient way to do transit. That's not regional transit. Those are 4 separate intra-city transit systems that don't talk to each other. And so, as the ORT board has been talking about this now for about a year, is that we feel that it's time. I think I speak for the board. I think that we all agree that it's time to change that. In an ideal world, I think anyone should be able to get on an ORT bus anywhere in Northwest Arkansas and get to any other bus stop anywhere in Northwest Arkansas on that bus, or maybe change bus once, but essentially it should be a regional series of fixed routes, and that you ought to be able to stop in Johnson or anywhere else along the way, and not be precluded from stopping in Johnson just because they don't have the money to contribute to a complete system within the city of Johnson, which wouldn't make any sense anyway. And as we regionalize and people don't live where they work or where they play, it's more and more important to think regionally about our transit system. So Rogers and Bentonville this year combined our 2 fixed routes into a single fixed route that goes from East Rogers to West Bentonville. And I know that Springdale and Fayetteville are having similar conversations, but that 71B over the long run offers an opportunity to have the backbone of a fixed route transit system that would connect the entire region, with spurs coming off of that. That's step one. The other step one is to encourage the density along these routes and at these centers to support those transit stops. You simply can't have transit, whether it's bus routes or rail someday, without the density to support it. Those things go hand in hand. So,
Yeah, the University of Arkansas is a prime example. I mean, their system works because they've got all these dorms and private residential places nearby that just flood the buses. My son lives down by close to Baum Stadium, and he occasionally he tries to get on the bus and it's full, So I mean it's there's a lot of students for sure. So the College Avenue kind of effort is also designed to some degree to not make it to where people don't have to travel by any vehicle to work and play and all of that.
Well, in the corridor plan that was worked on, there's like the before COVID times, right?
Yeah.
And so this is a plan from the before COVID times. And so it kind of dropped out of public memory for a little bit. And I think that's why for a lot of people this feels very new, but it's not new. We've been working on this plan, and we've been working on transportation improvement projects for years at this point. And so what I think is going to really change the perception is a series of street improvement projects along the corridor that will put in complete sidewalks, that will put in lighting, that will put in street trees, that will really transform the public realm and the public experience so that you can actually walk. And it's so interesting. I've been working on this for a couple of years, more publicly right now, but I've been working on this for a couple of years. In conversations with property owners and business owners last year, I would hear people say, well, people don't really walk along College Avenue in front of my business, so I don't know why you would do this. Well, the reason that people aren't walking is because you have to step through some pretty rough grass. You have to maybe walk through a parking lot that doesn't have a sidewalk. So now you're walking in a parking lot drive aisle, and because there's just a curb, and then there's wheel stops, and then there's pavement for cars, there's no space for you if you're on a bike. There's no space for you if you're on foot. You kind of have to navigate those things very carefully. And because it's incomplete, it doesn't give you a very good route to go Whereas if you're in a car, it's much easier. And College Avenue is not a place that we really want to be putting bikes in the street. People are driving fast, and there's not safe space for them. But if you could get that investment completed and get those projects underway, all of a sudden you have a very different way to travel. And so you do have other options. If you could live there, so it's easy to step out your door and hop on a great sidewalk that connects to a trail, that gets you on the greenway, that gets you to a lot of places you would want to go. That's a lifestyle that we have had so many people ask for, but because a lot of those opportunities are already taken up and it's hard to get housing that offers that opportunity. People are in subdivisions, and then they call us and say, well, when am I going to get a trail built close to my house so that I can access this network? We recently did a survey for the 71B project. We asked a bunch of preferences. Would you prefer this? Would you prefer this? Trying to get at, I think what John's talking about, Fayetteville, what are the values that you want to express through the outcomes that you're going to see? Or, how can we understand your values and develop a set of outcomes and requirements for those outcomes based on it? And most people responded that they drive a car, either on South School or on Nelson Hackett or on College Avenue. But then most people said, given the option, they would not prefer to drive a car. They would prefer to bike or walk. And so the preference is there, but the opportunity is not. And that's what we're trying to build. But it was really interesting to see. That was one of the more shocking results that we got, is how many people said, given the opportunity, I would not prefer a car. I would prefer to bike or walk.
Yeah, I know my own personal thing. I live about 3 miles from here. Once I got an e-bike, to me, unless you're a pretty decent athlete, which I am not, biking in Fayetteville is a challenge because there's always a hill right around the corner. And once I got an e-bike, suddenly I was able to zip down here to the office and, go down to the mall, all that. And now the trail is working its way a little closer with the work that's going on Old Wire. So, it's really exciting to see those kinds of options opening up in Northwest Arkansas. So as we kind of wrap up, I'm curious, what kind of feedback you guys are getting. Do people grasp how much what you guys are working on is going to well, it's not that what you guys are working on is going to change Northwest Arkansas. It's like you were saying earlier, Northwest Arkansas is going to change, and this is kind of establishing some boundaries for it. But I've just got this impression that there are a lot of people that, like when we're talking about the College Avenue thing, some of the images and some of the documents that show what College Avenue might look like, it's just like, holy cow, that looks nothing like what we deal with right now. And you mentioned like a wheelchair going down the street. I've seen one or two over the years, and I'm scared to death for them on College Avenue. But the I really don't know that people fully grasp the real fundamental nature of the changes that are happening and that these documents will guide. Am I overstating that?
Well, as a relative newcomer myself, having moved here at the beginning of January, that's my observation, is that people that have been here for a few years or maybe a lifetime really do not grasp the pace of change. I came from Kansas City, and there's growth there, but as a city, it's more stable. And this region is I can sense it, I can feel it, I can see the changes. That's part of the reason I came here, is I wanted to be a part of a region that was building itself into a city. And whether or not we want it to be a city, the fact is that the population growth is going to dictate that it is. And so, like John and Britin have both said, it's all about how do we want to become a big city. We are going to become one, and we have a choice to make. And I think every city in the region is trying to provide options at the individual level, so that people can make their own individual choices that are best for them. But I think it's a very exciting time for this area, and I do agree with you that there there is I think a lack of understanding of how quickly things are changing and fundamentally things are changing in this area.
So does that make the job harder?
I think it means the way that we need to listen to communities is really challenging. I think when people have a bad experience or they see outcomes that they don't enjoy, people don't always phrase that in our language. So planners have a very specific language. Like we could all sit here and get into kind of planner speak. It uses a lot of acronyms and it confuses a lot of people. And so it may not be in our language, but people are still expressing, I think, concern about change, concern about how it impacts them, and then also sometimes dissatisfaction with the outcomes. And so one of the wonderful things that we have the opportunity to do in these code rewrites, in doing these comprehensive plans, is to capture what is the outcome that you're looking to see. And I think that's so important to convey to people, because we're not necessarily going to capture that in social media comments, and we're not going to necessarily capture that in your conversations with your neighbors. And so when we do big surveys or big planning projects and we have public meetings and people don't show up and they don't participate, we're losing an opportunity to hear from people about what their expectations are for the outcomes. And that is increasingly challenging as we grow so fast, because there are so many more people that are being affected by that. And so I think it's really important for people to take those opportunities if they have the time available, because that's how we know what your expectations are, what you're looking for, and how we can make improvements. But if we don't get that feedback, it's really hard to know that that was the expectation.
So we've tried to pack a lot into about 45 minutes here in this podcast. I know it's a lot to ask, and I appreciate you guys attempting to have that conversation over these issues. I will include some links with this podcast, the information with this podcast that will help people get to some of the documents that explain a little bit about what is going on in the two communities. And maybe I'll have you guys back sometime when we can drill in on something a little more capable of fitting into a small time period. But it's been a good discussion, and I appreciate all of y'all being here very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
All right. Well, we appreciate you guys joining us for this podcast, the Speaking of Arkansas podcast, and we will catch you next time. See you later.